Papo, one of the first companies that really started pushing the boundaries with dinosaur figures. During their golden ages, they were considered to be one of the best, if not the best, brands to buy from. But recently, they've kind of spiraled into mediocrity at best and absolute garbage at worst. Let's look at some of the past few years. In 2021, possibly due to the pandemic, all they were able to release is a baby Smilodon and a Megalodon, both of which are decent on their own, but a very disappointing output. In 2022, they repainted one of their classic figures so horribly it looks like a knockoff, and also created this abomination. I have owned the Papo Triceratops, keyword owned, and it still haunts me to this day. In 2023, they released the Ionosaurus, which is a figure I personally hate. I'm honestly annoyed it's not talked about as much. And the infamous Concavinator, which surely overshadowed it. But in 2024, they released two, again, kind of mediocre figures, the Coryphosaurus and Ampulosaurus, but then they pulled out the Suchomimus. To this day, I consider the Suchomimus to be one of the best, if not the best, Papo figures from the images alone. I do not own this figure, but I plan to acquire it sometime in the future. And this is, I think, a year, even more, after it was announced, after the first images came out. The hype on this thing has worn down, and I can reflect back on it and still say it's one of the best things Papo has ever made. But I was sure it was gonna be a dud. I didn't think that Papo could pull off another Suchomimus again. And well, yeah, they didn't pull off another Suchomimus, but they did come pretty close. Papo 2025 is phenomenal. Not in general, but for the company. This is one of the best years they've had since their glory days. Yeah, 2024 is regarded as a good year for the absolutely awesome Suchomimus, but does anyone even remember the Coryphosaurus and Ampulosaurus? I don't think so. Whereas all of the 2025 figures seem memorable, at least in some way. But I definitely have opinions on them, and I would gladly take some over others. Starting with the Yangchuangosaurus. When I heard announcements, this was probably the figure I was most excited for. And now that the promo images are here, I couldn't find any good images of these guys, so I'm basing it off of this. I can pretty safely say that the Yangchuangosaurus looks to be a good figure. The pose seems a bit wonky. I especially don't like the back leg, but it could just be the angle and the fact that the tail is bent. And they gave it a head shape somewhat similar to the PNSO one, which I like because that was an absolutely great Yangchuangosaurus. And the hands are not pronated. Good job, Papo. That's one of the tropes they fell into extremely often. But I don't think they've done a theropod with pronated hands for a long time. Even the Concavinator, I'm pretty sure, didn't have pronated hands. Next up is the Edmontosaurus, and this figure also looks good. It's a crystallis Edmontosaur, and it seems to have some pretty nice colors, though it's hard to tell because I could only find such blurry images of these guys. The sculpt work seems to be pretty decent. This one, well, it's less impressive than the Yangchuang. I think it's ultimately a better figure. Then is the Walking with Dinosaurs one of Achiris. I mean the Papo and Hungera. I get Walking with Dinosaurs vibes from this thing, and I think that was the intention. It wouldn't be the first time a company tried to get those Walking with Dinosaurs vibes, not even with just this creature. And yeah, I already have the Schleichen Hungera, which is probably a worse depiction of it, but I like it. I think it has some charm. So I don't have much motive to get this figure. It's also the least memorable one of the line for me, but that's mostly just because plain old flying pterosaurs tend to mesh in my brain. The only pterosaur figures I remember are the really unique ones. So yeah, I'm not too hyped about this one, but it is a good figure. And for the worst figure of a year for Papo to be a just okay one is incredibly shocking, because if this came out in 2021 or 2022 or 2023, it would be the best of that year. Even if it came out in 2024, it would be the second best after the Suchomimus. Then finally is the one I was most curious to see when I first heard the names announced. And that is the feathered Tyrannosaurus. I mentioned the thing with no pronated wrists on the Yank-Chuangosaurus, and yeah, unfortunately it does look like this one has pronated wrists, but again, I can't really tell if those are pronated wrists or if they just gave it tiny hands as it should have, because of how blurry this image is. And I have to say, the idea of a feathered T-Rex seemed kind of weird. Like, the Tyrannosaurus being feathered theory kind of died down in recent years, and I expected more of a fantasy design, kind of like that one Smilodon, which was basically just an African lion with epic teeth. And I expected more of a fantasy design, but to my surprise, it looks like they gave this Tyrannosaurus a more accurate head shape than any of the previous. Again, it's hard to say for sure, but this doesn't look like the Tyrannosaurus from Jurassic Park with a coat of feathers plucked onto it. They could have just tried to make the one from the Prologue and Dominion, but they created their own interesting design, which seems to be slightly more based on an actual Tyrannosaurus than on the Jurassic Park one. Which, if that's the case, then that's great. If it's not the case, I'll be quite disappointed, but just looking at that alone might have made the feathered Rex my favorite from this entire line. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the feathering application. It has a big tail fan, which is probably the one thing about this figure I don't like. Again, for a more fantasy-oriented design, it's fine, but I would have rather preferred a nice feathery mane, which it doesn't seem to have many feathers on the body. I'm not sure if those black and green splotches are meant to be feathers, but I'm pretty sure those are just different blends of colors on the figure. This is one that I want to revisit once some better photos come out, because whereas the other three have given me fairly good first impressions, this one sort of puzzled me, and that makes me interested in it, because I see the potential. I see the slightly more accurate head shape, and I know that's an incredibly strange reason to claim that this may be the best figure of 2025, though I think that this feathered Tyrannosaurus could potentially steal the crown of one of my favorite large papopheropods other than the Suchomimus. Nothing is beating that. And I already prefer to every other Tyrannosaurus that Papo has ever made. Ultimately, I think Papo's back.